There we are. I think looks like it's going now. Okay, perfect. So we will kick off then with I think we're going to have the first item on the agenda first, and then I think Councillor Fedorovich is going to speak a little bit later, is it? Perfect. So have we got any apologies? Perhaps?
Yeah, we've received one apology from Councillor Jan O'Hara.
Perfect. Thank you. So item number 2, members' declarations of interest. Have we got any declarations of interest?
No, we haven't received any.
Okay. And then on to item number 3, notifications of request to address the meeting, which we have 1.
Yep, at this time we invite Councillor Fedorovich to address the panel.
When you're ready.
All right, just finding you. Lovely. Thank you. Morning. Morning, sort of chair, councillors' officers. Hope you're well. I understand that this first meeting is a sort of setting the scene meeting, understanding the sort of scope of the group and purpose, and getting to some background on the various topics related to climate change. Of course, within the scope is the climate change strategy and action plan, but it's not really clear how the council will translate that plan into action for the executive. So I sort of wanted to raise that and ask, will the group specifically advise on priorities and get these approved by the council as motions, or how frequently will these priorities get approved? Also, are the executive possibly able to make a move on any of the items in the action plan yet? Or could they maybe start making a move on quick wins if the plan is as a whole approved, and then this group could feed in priorities from each meeting, that sort of thing, just sort of trying to find out more about that. I'm also, I'm sure most of these questions will be answered today, but mainly the key is that we have this sort of well-researched climate change strategy that we need to translate into action as quickly and effectively as possible. So I'd just like to find out more about how we can do that, really. And yes, some of the quick wins that the panel might want to suggest as a priority for the council might be some of the following, like banning the use of glyphosate across the country, the county, sorry. At the moment, it's costing us about £180,000 a year. And it's a pesticide that we already know is harmful to human health and kills bees and pollinators. So obviously some other councils are opting now to just completely ban it and instead use a non-toxic substance such as vinegar. And obviously we've got the Pardon the Weeds, we're feeding the bees campaign, which we could push a little harder. Creating policies for the planning committee to ensure that eco criteria for sort of new developments is in line with our action plan's aspirations for biodiversity, and creating other policies to crack down on unnecessary sort of plant and tree removals. And then other things like sort of recommending an appropriate solution to the fly tipping issues that we've got, such as reducing the cost for commercial vehicles taking waste to the recycling centre, extending the hours of the centre so it's more accessible, things like that. I'm sure this is all definitely going to be discussed, but in terms of those, I was just wanted to raise some small points in terms of quick wins that we might be able to look at, and yeah, just to get things moving as quickly as possible, because I know you're all aware that we need to move quickly. The climate crisis that we're in is sort of upon us, and we really need to move as though the house is on fire and all that stuff. So yeah, I really look forward to hearing how this group progresses, but thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. That was really good to get your thoughts on those, and I'm sure we'll discuss the points you've raised. You know, some of them we may have to bring back at a later date to discuss in more detail, but yeah, like you say, we have got to make sure what we do counts. As you rightly say, as Greta Thunberg has said, we've got to get acting now, and there's a responsibility, and I personally acutely feel the pressure and the responsibility to make sure we have a positive impact with what we're doing. But thank you very much. So I think at this stage we will move on to item 4 of the agenda. We can come back to the points raised by Councillor Fedorovich as we get onto the discussion part of the agenda. I think that would be most appropriate, and then we can provide hopefully some feedback to her following her address there, if that's all right with everybody. So at this point, I will hand over to George Candler, who's the Director of Place and Economy, to give us a presentation on the terms of reference for the EAP.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. As Councillor Pentland has said, my name is George Kendall. I'm Exec Director for Place and Economy. Started on the 1st of April. And just by way of background, have done this role before in a previous unitary authority, and also been a former chief exec as well, just by way of background of myself. But very pleased to be all on this executive advisory panel alongside my colleagues who you'll get to meet a bit later. So turning to the report that you've got in front of you, there's a covering report which I'll just touch on briefly, which basically gives an overview of the purpose of the executive advisory panel, which, as you'll see in 4.1, is a key component of the hybrid model of governance that you've probably already had described to you by our monitoring officer, Adele Wiley. And it's very much about inclusive decision making. And the panel has been established by the executive to provide advice back into them. So hence the sort of rhythm of meetings should precede each of the executive meetings that are coming up. It's also about cross-party involvement around that policy formulation, pre-decision. And it's also an opportunity to consult with you on forthcoming matters to get your advice so that we can reflect that before anything goes forward to the executive. It doesn't have any decision-making powers, and as you'll see within the main body of the report, they're intended to be informal in nature and ultimately to stimulate debate. So there's 5 of these across the council, and the sort of broad remit of them is detailed within the Constitution, which has already been previously agreed. And the terms of reference of this Climate Change, Environment and Growth EAP is attached to Appendix A, which I will just touch on briefly. You'll see in 4.5 that they're not subject to the full Local Government Act, but they are going to be conducted where practicable, as if an act was applied, hence agendas, hence democratic services being here to minute them, hence live streaming and being fully transparent. You'll see that we're meeting monthly, so there's going to be a lot of opportunity to bring key items forward, and clearly we want that to come as much from yourselves as panel members as obviously some of the work that we'll be doing through the executive members, portfolio holders, with some of the key work that we are already having to focus in on. You'll see under 4.7 that the meetings will normally be held virtually, as we are today, although I believe the Chair may want to come back on that particular point before we get to approval of recommendations. And again, there will be crossover of items. So the other sort of remit is to ensure that we can look at other areas that may fall into another part of one of the executive advisory panels. So, for example, Councillor Federich highlighted planning policy. Now, planning policy is actually covered in a separate executive advisory panel, which is chaired by Councillor Stephen North. That doesn't mean that we can't have a view on planning policy here, particularly within the remit of this panel, and it will be useful that we use some of our thinking to help inform the planning policy advisory panel. So turning to the terms of reference themselves, again, I'm not going to talk too much about these because hopefully you've had a chance to read through them, and they're not overly extensive, but they are here for discussion before finalisation. You'll see the objective exclusive, as you'll see there, but it gives a flavour of some of the areas that can be considered by this particular executive advisory panel. But I wouldn't want that list to be, that's all that we're going to cover. We will go within the remit of the overall panel that you can see there. And the other key thing to mention is obviously there's quite a lot coming out from central government as well at the moment, particularly around national policy, which Graham Kane will touch on, Rob Harbour will touch on around planning policy as well a little bit later. And again, there's an opportunity when that comes out that we bring some of that to this particular panel to get views to help inform our responses and our future direction with regards to that. You'll see membership is detailed there, which you'll be familiar with. The only other thing just really to mention, as I mentioned earlier, there's 5 panels in total, and planning policy covers off one sort of part of the growth and regeneration section, which you'll hear a bit more about shortly. So at the moment, this panel covers everything else that is within place and economy, and some of those areas you may be more interested in than others. And again, we'll take the steer from yourselves, but again, we'll be bringing quite a bit that's coming through across those 4 functional areas that you can see detailed on the second page there. Other than that, Chair, I'll refer back to yourself. Obviously, there's recommendations there, but there may be questions and comments on the papers. Thank you.
Thank you. So to kick off, do we have any questions at this stage? And then I will talk about one of the points George has highlighted there. You can't. Oh, Councillor Lee.
Thank you. I welcome all the officers we have here. When I was on the panel for climate change, when we produced the action plan, we benefited from the input of fantastic officers who had knowledge to help us, Phil Jones and Sarah Earle. Will they be joining us as well? And how many of those officers do we have at the moment who can help us in relation to climate change and the measures that we can take?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know whether Rob, this falls within Rob Harbour's area, within Growth and Regeneration, Councillor Lee. So through you, Chair, am I okay to ask Rob to come in on that particular point?
Please do.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks, Councillor Lee, for the question, which is a good one, and I think is very pertinent, really, to the discussion that we're going to have about being able to move work forward. Unfortunately, you're absolutely right. Phil Jones and Sarah Earle, extremely good, experienced officers with lots of knowledge around climate change, sustainability and other environmental issues. Sadly, Phil Jones has already left the authority to take up a position at Anglian Water. So I think he did that within the first 2 weeks of Northants Council. And Sarah Earle leaves us at the start of next week. So it unfortunately does put us in the short term on the back foot in terms of having those expertise in-house, because they really were the 2 key officers that would have enabled us to move forward, I think, relatively quickly with some of the things in the task and finish group action plan. That's not to say that we're not moving forward with some of those things. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. So in answer to your question, unfortunately, Phil and Sarah won't be joining this group for those reasons. They won't be with the authority. And obviously what I need to do in terms of my review of the structure of growth and regeneration is to consider how we replace that lost resource by recruiting new staff into a team, which will then enable us to drive the agenda forward.
Thank you, Rob. Just had to get myself off mute there. Have we got any other questions at this stage? Doesn't look like it. So I wanted to draw your attention to 4.7 of the report on the terms of reference, which, as George pointed out, talks about the mode, so to speak, of how the meetings will be held. Now, from my perspective, I don't have a problem with holding them virtually. I think actually, as the climate change EAP, it's a way in which we can reduce our carbon footprint slightly by not all travelling to one location. And I mean, particularly at the minute, it's prudent to not all be in the same room as each other as well. It may, however, in the future, be useful for us to meet on occasion in person, as sometimes that can help with the flow of discussion, etc. And we want to make sure we're getting the most out of these. So my suggestion is for the terms of reference that we allow the chair to have discretion as to whether we perhaps need to have a meeting in person occasionally. But like I say, I think virtually is probably setting, hopefully, a good example of our commitment to reducing our impact on the climate. I guess I'd be keen to hear other people's views on that before we kind of jump ahead and do that. But certainly that's my hope. If anybody's got any comments. Councillor Prentice.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think you're right. Obviously, the main purpose of this is to ensure that the county is working in a greener way, as it were, and keeping carbon footprint down. I do think, to add to your point though about making sure conversations flow well and the debates are meaningful, if we feel, or if you feel that the debate could be better if we were face to face, then I would be keen that we do that, because obviously the point of the meeting is to be constructive, and if we're not being constructive over Zoom because of lack of body language and lack of decent debate, then perhaps we would need to look at maybe moving at least half of the meetings to face or something like that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And those are the thoughts exactly I had. I think we need to keep it under review a bit and see how we go. At least if we've got the discretion there, we've got the option to do either or, and work it so that we are getting the most out of these sessions. So I'm just flicking between documents here. So if there are no other questions that we want to raise, I think if we kind of go to the recommendations as set out in the report, which, gosh, I can't find the, so that if we go to recommendation 1, which is to note the terms of reference, perhaps with a slight change on the wording of 4.7. Is everybody happy with that? I think if we show our hands or something, or shout if you're not. Okay, that looks all right. And then that we also note the panel's duties and responsibilities within the terms of reference under the approved council constitution. So again, shout if you've got a problem with that, because it's easier for me to see. Okay, perfect. So I hope we're all good there, and we can move on to the next item. So item 5, which is the overview of economy and place. And again, I'm going to hand back to George for a presentation here.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm just going to check, Raj, are you going to share the slide deck on screen?
Yeah, I can share the slides now if you'd like me to. 1 second.
So while Raj is just bringing that up on screen, members, so I'm going to kickstart with the first, the next 3 slides, and then I'm going to hand over to each of the assistant directors who are with us this morning, and they will give a brief overview of their respective areas. Then we'll go back to the agenda. The next agenda item then is sort of key areas of focus, which is when we'll start to drop into those areas again. And obviously through you, Chair, should we run through the slide deck and then take questions at the end? Would that be the easiest?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, great. Okay, so in terms of so I'm just toggling around with my screens here at the moment as well, so forgive me. So in terms of place and economy, as you can see, and it was also in the terms of reference, there are 4 key functional areas across place and economy. As you can see there, so highways and waste, which is led by Mccain, growth and regeneration, which is led by Rob Harbour, and that's the area that's also got planning policy in. So everything that you'll hear from Rob will be everything bar planning policy that sits with the other executive advisory panel. Assets environment is Jonathan Waterworth, and regulatory services is Ian Smith. So all 4 assistant directors are with us this morning, and you'll get to know them well, I'm sure, over the next 12 months and beyond, as we work together on this panel. Just a brief bit of context setting, and you will have seen some of this already, in terms of the overall budget of the council, which is just short of 300 million, that's net. Place and economy is just short of 20% of that budget, so a fairly activity. We also generate quite a lot of income as well, particularly with our commercial estate, which I'll let Jonathan touch on. And a number of our areas are also tied up in fairly sizable contracts that we've got with third-party providers. And again, big chunks of that are in highways and waste, which again, Graham will touch on a little later. And as I've already mentioned, planning policy has its own dedicated executive advisory panel, although we can look in, and if there are specific elements around climate, environment and growth that actually is primarily in policy, that doesn't stop us as a panel wanting to have a look at that. And indeed, we may invite Councillor North to this meeting, and vice versa. Councillor Pentland may also get invited to the planning policy executive advisory panel to ensure that cross filtering of ideas and advice. So moving on to the next slide, please, Raj. So again, the team will touch on this, but there's a real mix across place and economy of district and borough services. So this is, you've probably heard us use the term aggregate or bring, in plain English, bring together the district and borough services. So a lot of that has happened across place, but also there's quite a bit of former county council services which have had to be split north and west. Now some of those areas are hosted and some are led by the respective authority. And again, I don't want to steal my colleagues' thunder. I have a danger of drifting into their bits of the presentation, so I'm going to resist. But some of them are hosted by ourselves, which means that those service areas, there wasn't sufficient time to disaggregate, so they're invariably former county council services. There wasn't enough time to disaggregate those services. And so they've gone to, sorry, Raj. Back one again, thank you. They went, there wasn't enough time to disaggregate them pre-vesting day. And so they're hosted for up to 12 months, in some cases slightly longer, to allow the teams to do that separation over the next 12 months. Those that are led, which predominantly are the back office areas and led in the West, particularly around pensions, for example, is one area. It's felt more efficient and commercially appropriate, particularly where there's income involved, to leave one authority to lead that. And those decisions were taken pre-vesting day by the respective shadow executives in the North and in the West. So as officers, and I stress this is an officer view within place and economy, we believe our focus is for our people, for our businesses, and for our environment. So that's sort of our as officers, that's what we believe the vision is for place and economy. And also we're starting to scope out internally what those strategic priorities should look like across place and economy. And you can see them detailed there on the slide around that growth, but not just growth for growth's sake, but sustainable growth. And particularly in the current climate where obviously the pandemic has had quite a damaging effect on a number of our business sectors. So how do we start to work with those sectors and develop sustainable growth going forward? It's very much about enhancing the environment, and again, something that this panel will be particularly interested in. And also about connecting our communities. One of the sort of USPs is the mix of market towns and rurality, and again that wonderful green environment that we've got across Northamptonshire. But it's also important that we connect those communities so that they feel a sense of place, feel a sense of belonging, but also around the wider well-being agenda, so that we minimise social isolation, that we improve mental and physical well-being. So a role to play there around connecting our communities. And then finally, transforming the way we work. So as a new authority, we recognise that with bringing those different functional areas together, there's a real opportunity, led by elected members, co-designing with our key stakeholders, a real opportunity to reshape, redesign, and transform the way that we work going forward. So moving on to the next slide before I hand over to colleagues. What I love about this role, what I love about working in place, is that it touches so many people day to day in a local context, whether people are enjoying the fantastic countryside that we might be maintaining, walking on our footpaths, taking advantage of our cycleways, but also our impact across the whole of Northants, where we can start to develop a strategic focus and a strategic coordinated approach to the way we want to do things, and climate change and the action plan and strategy around that will clearly be one, but there will be others that will be coming forward. There's also that wider sort of SEMLEP, and apologies, there's an abbreviation there, but for members on the panel, SEMLEP actually stands for South East Midlands Local Enterprise Partnership. So that's one of 40 plus local enterprise partnerships established by government some years ago to drive the growth agenda in a slightly wider regional based approach. So again, our involvement in that area, alongside our colleagues at Bedford Borough, Central Beds, Luton, and of course West Northamptonshire and Milton Keynes are going to be key. And finally, that wider Oxford, Cambridge arc, which is very much a key focus of central government at the moment. They're very keen to see accelerated growth, but accelerated green growth is the focus of the arc. They published their prospectus last autumn, and again, we're working with them on how we start to develop some of the actions from that. But obviously that involves quite a wide footprint of local authorities, of universities that we've got in that wider ARC environment, and also the business sector, and the voluntary sector. So quite a broad church to be encompassing that long-term green growth agenda across the ARC. It's also about shaping places for future generations, but also it's about the here and now. So you'll hear from the four assistant directors that the work that we do is much about dealing with the grass cutting and the pesticides that we might be using, which Councillor Federich was referring to start to shape and connect communities over the next 10, 20, 30 years with the networks that we need to put in place, with the housing growth that we know is coming, and we need to shape that appropriately over the coming 10, 20 years, as I say, for future generations. And to conclude, before I hand on to colleagues, it's crucial that this is driven and led by elected members. We are a member-led authority, but I think that approach around partnership working, collaboration, the opportunity to co-design and co-produce with other key stakeholders, I think will also ensure that whilst things may take a little longer to work through, actually the outcomes are far richer, and actually have many more advocates as a result of that. And you also start to see the pace pick up because you have that buy-in by a broad range of stakeholders. So I'm going to hand on, if we can just move on to the next slide, please, Raj, to Graham. And he's just going to take you through an overview of his particular area, and he will pass on to the remaining 3 assistant directors. Graham.
Thank you, George. Good morning, everybody. My name is Graham Mccain. I'm the Assistant Director for Highways and Waste. It's a pleasure to meet you all. So I'll just take you through the slide briefly, highlighting some of the areas that my teams look after. First of all, we've got highways on the left-hand side there. Highways maintenance is what we are all familiar with in terms of maintaining the road infrastructure, but it's so much more than just repairing potholes. We repair an awful lot of potholes every single day, every week of the year. We are out there continually looking for what we call defects in the road surface and repairing those as best we can. But it's so much more than that as well. It's obviously the pavements, it's the curbs, it's the gullies and the drainage system. It's the bridges, it's street lights, it's traffic management and traffic controls such as traffic lights, it's roundabouts and so forth. So it's a huge endeavour to keep on top of all the highways infrastructure. And to give you some kind of sense of the scale there, across Northamptonshire, we've got 1,824 kilometres of road length to keep on top of. We've also got 266 bridges that we maintain. And in terms of streetlights, which I'll mention later on, we've got just about 24,000 streetlights that we look after as well. But also into highways maintenance, we also have the rights of way network, which is obviously really important to allow people to get outside and enjoy the more rural areas of the area. And there we've got over 3,000 kilometres of rights of way network that we maintain as best we can, again, stiles, bridges, surfaces, etc., so that people can get out. And we've seen those really being hugely beneficial and popular, particularly in the last 18 months through COVID and the lockdown. I'm sure you're all aware, more and more people getting out and enjoying those spaces, so we've done our best to maintain those as well. Then I'll move on to home to school transport. So we transport children who are eligible for free transport to school, depending on where they live and what school they access. And throughout every day, we are transporting just shy of 8,000 children, pupils, to an education establishment in Northamptonshire. That's across the whole of Northamptonshire, because we still run it as one service around the old county boundary. So just shy of 8,000 across the whole area of Northamptonshire to approximately 180 different educational establishments. And that's about 600 routes, just to give you an idea of how many routes we're running all the time. And those are mostly done by external operators, so bus companies and taxi firms who deliver those services for them. In addition to the mainstream pupils, who can sort of have more standard transport, if you like, buses and so forth, we also have those children who need more special educational needs. And we've got about 1,300 of them as well, where they need a more tailored transport solution to get them to their place of education through the day. Then I'll move on to strategic transport planning. This is the big stuff, if you like. This is the future infrastructure that we need. So big investment in our road network, new roads, new bypasses, perhaps. This is where this sits within the team. And also within this, I include our public transport as well. So bus infrastructure, current bus infrastructure and services delivered through private firms, and also our future planning for public transport as well sits within this small team as well. Then we've got street lighting, which I mentioned. The vast majority of the street lighting across the area is provided by Balfour Beatty through a PFI that we have for Balfour Beatty. So they maintain those street lights for us, and we obviously work with them to ensure that the standards are as they should be. Active travel is a relatively new term. I think for most of us that generally means walking and cycling. This is a big focus of attention for the Department for Transport at the moment in government. Very keen for all the public health benefits, environmental benefits to get us all cycling and walking. And it's been a continual challenge for many decades, as we know, all the challenges to try and encourage people to get out of their cars and get onto bikes and to walk. And it's particular focus, as I say, it had a lot of salience during lockdown. Government were keen to promote active travel to get us out of cars and car sharing, and also appreciating that healthier people generally avoid the worst effects of COVID. So we are working hard as well to try and promote active travel in a number of different ways. Some of you will be aware that we are progressing with our local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, known as LC WIPs, and we've got a number of those that we want to develop across Northamptonshire, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point in this forum in the future. And then finally, on the highway side, we've got highways development management, and this is the planning element of transport. So when planning applications come in, my team will assess them and provide advice in terms of what the implications might be for the transport network. Sometimes they're fairly minimal, but obviously larger applications, commercial applications, large residential schemes will have an implication on the transport network and may require additional roads or link roads or roundabout, changes to roundabout, etc., etc. And then when developers have developed out their area, they will obviously have roads on those new estates, and my team are involved in making sure those roads are up to standard before we adopt them. And then we maintain them once they've been adopted and gone through that process. So a continual and big piece of work there for that team. Now, I think if you just press the slide forward, I think, please. I think there we go. So you've just seen, hopefully you've just seen an orange box come up on the left-hand side around highways. And this links back to what George was saying around how these services are delivered at the moment. So currently in that orange box on the left-hand side, all those services are currently hosted by West Northamptonshire. So we receive that service from the West. And then in turn, Kier WSP deliver some of these services to West and North Northamptonshire. So they're currently our contractor, Kier WSP are our contractor, and they provide some of those services through the West on to us. I obviously liaise very closely to the West. I'm speaking to them and liaising with them every single day on these matters, both strategic and operational. We've got very good relationships with them. And I also have direct relationship with Kier WSP, not a contractual one because that comes through the West, but I have a relationship directly with Kier WSP. So we can ensure that we are getting things done in the North that need to be done on our highways network. Moving over to waste then, I'll go through this quite quickly. You'll be very familiar with all these services because we all benefit from them every day and every week generally. But all the waste recycling and residual waste, as we call it, collection service is provided by my team. We currently have different arrangements, obviously, in the previous district and borough areas. So slightly different collection arrangements in some of the different areas and different methods of collection and different service provision as well. So, for instance, East Northamptonshire is provided by a contractor, FCC. Corby and Kettering is an in-house service provided directly by ourselves. And then Wellingborough North is delivered by a joint venture called, Wellingborough is delivered by Wellingborough North, which is a joint venture between ourselves and a company called Norse. So slightly different arrangements at the moment because we've inherited those, but over time, obviously, we will look to harmonise things as much as we possibly can. Street cleaning, again, the same, delivered by different types of organisation, if you like, but all our responsibility around the street cleaning, and that's obviously litter picking, but also the street sweeping of our roads as well, and emptying litter bins, etc. Bulky waste collections, we provide a bulky waste collection charged for residents to be able to dispose of or have things collected from their front door to be taken away, so they don't need to take it to an HWRC, and they can be sure that it's been picked up by a legitimate organisation who's going to dispose of it responsibly. Then obviously Enviro Crime, which is a really important one, so environmental antisocial behaviour, if you like, so fly tipping, littering and dog fouling. Sadly, we're all far too familiar with this, so we spend an awful lot of time and energy trying to keep on top of this. First bit is obviously keeping the area clean so it doesn't attract fly tipping and littering, but also it's about education and awareness, and then finally, where necessary, it's also about an enforcement approach and issuing of tickets for those people who can continue to carry out these environmental crimes. So we do a lot of activity around that. Then we get onto the disposal side of things. So all of this waste that we collect obviously has to be disposed of. So we have a number of different contracts for residual or general waste. And we also have a number of different contracts for recyclables as well. So we collect it, then we pass it on to various other third parties who dispose of it in various different responsible manners, of course, highly regulated industry. And we engage with that process clearly. Then we've also got our household waste and recycling centres. So we've got 4, is that right? 4 in the north, which have proven to be always very popular. And you can dispose of, we're all familiar with them, but I'm sure we've all been to them over the time. But you can separate all your recycling into various different waste streams, and we encourage people to do that. Then finally, we have closed landfills. Not many people sort of engage with us on our closed landfills. These are, as they indicate, they're landfills that were previously used over many, many decades in the past, historic landfills, as we refer to them as. They're no longer open, waste isn't going in there, but some of them need managing clearly to make sure that any pollutants from the previous waste that's buried there doesn't leak out into the wider environment. Again, highly regulated sector. The Environment Agency have a great deal of regulation of what we do, and we have good relationships with them with various different permits and licensing requirements that we have. The most actively managed site we have is in Corby, where, as I say, we manage it every week. We're up there measuring things and making sure that the site is secure, so that we're containing any pollutants that might be in there. And that green box on the right-hand side there, that indicates that those services there, the disposal of waste, the HWRCs and the closed landfills, are currently a service that we host in the north and we provide it back to the west. So I have a small team that sits with us in the north, but they still provide those services across to the west. The intention with both of those hosted teams, both the highways and the waste team, is that they were to be hosted for 12 months. So in the process of this year, we are looking to, as George indicated, disaggregate those teams so that the West and the North will have their individual teams to provide for those services by themselves. And I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions whenever that's appropriate.
Thanks. So through you, Chair, if it's okay, we'll do the overview of each area, and then through you, Chair, perhaps pause and take any questions before we move on to areas of focus, which is the next part of the slide deck. Is that okay with you, Chair?
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks, Raj. If we can just move the slide on one more. Oh, I think it was Rob that was up next. So Rob, do you want to start while Raj? Oh, we've got it back on screen. Great.
It is back on.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Rob Harbour, Assistant Director for Growth and Regeneration. So you can see up here on this slide, on the left-hand side in blue are the functions which mainly relate to planning. And that's split down into a number of different things, some of which you may well be familiar with, some possibly less so. So planning management, this is the part of the service that deals with planning applications that are deposited with the council. and it assesses and determines those applications either through delegated authority or by members through the planning committee system. Just to give you a flavour, in fact, application numbers this year are higher than certainly the last couple of years. And I think we will probably anticipate dealing with something like 3,500 planning applications across the North Northants this year. So that service is split up into 5 teams, 5 area teams. They reflect the areas that serve the local area planning committees. So that's one for Corby, Thrapston, Kettering, Wellingborough, and we have a North Northants strategic planning committee that covers the whole of North Northants for those sort of larger and more strategic applications that also come forward. So, for example, the North Northants Garden Community Sustainable Urban Extensions, those kind of applications would go to the strategic committee. Planning enforcement is another part of the service. It's something where I'm aware members have an aspiration that we beef up that service so that it can operate more effectively and with teeth. We do have one at the moment, but I would have to say that in terms of enforcement resource, it is relatively thin. Nonetheless, they're probably dealing with somewhere in the region of 800 to 1,000 live enforcement cases at any one time. So it's actually a significant amount of enforcement that they're dealing with. Planning policy, we sort of talked about this, or George talked about this, touched on it a little bit earlier in the presentation. It's a key part of planning. It's where we develop those plans for North Northamptonshire. They fall into the strategic plan, used to be called the Joint Core Strategy. Well, the approved one still is. The new one that we're just starting will be called the North Northamptonshire Strategic Plan. That covers the sort of higher level policy work, and then a series of Part 2 local plans which cover each of the areas within North Northamptonshire, which again reflect the old sovereign authority areas. And then sitting underneath those, there are lots of other bits of policy. There's neighbourhood plans and development plan documents, supplementary planning documents, and so on and so forth. Minerals and waste planning is a function where we are the lead authority in North Northamptonshire. So we provide this on behalf of both North Northants and West Northants. This is made up of the former County Council Minerals and Waste Planning team, and as you might expect, kind of does what it says on the tin. It deals with those issues around minerals and waste. So, for example, things like minerals extraction, quarrying, and so on and so forth, all fall within the remit of that particular team. And they also deal with policy development around minerals and waste as well. And I think probably the other thing which is worth saying there is that they do a significant amount of work on behalf of other local authorities. So, for example, Milton Keynes, Rutland. I think they're in discussion with Nottinghamshire or no, Sheffield authorities at the moment, South Yorkshire, and they do some stuff for Leicester City as well. So they're able to promote their services far and wide, and indeed that brings in an income for the authority as well in doing so. And then at the bottom there's street naming and numbering. It's sort of a small but important function nonetheless. because we all need to find our way around. And one of the ways we can do that is through naming streets. So primarily, this is obviously new development. When we have a new housing development, streets are built, they need to be named, has to go through a kind of formal process. And again, with all the housing that sits on those streets, they need a numbering scheme. And so that's done by staff well, they form parts of a number of different teams at the moment, but that is that's their role. Moving on to the right hand side of the slide are the kind of non-planning related stuff, although a lot of it actually links in very closely to planning in lots of ways. So growth and investment. This is quite a holistic look at growth, and it touches on lots of things. Some of the things that Graham's talked about in terms of strategic transport planning, thinking about how we deliver growth in the future, the interrelationship between that physical growth in terms of homes, employment space, roads, you know, and all the infrastructure that goes along with that in terms of education, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And then investment, which is effectively how we afford to deliver that growth and that infrastructure. And that's always a tricky conundrum. It's fair to say we generally have an infrastructure funding gap, fairly significant. I think the last thing I read, we were probably about £1/3 billion short in terms of the gap to provide all the infrastructure that we really need. But that's common. It's not specific to Northampton. It's common across the whole country. But it is a challenge nonetheless to try to find ways of investing in the infrastructure that we need. From a regeneration point of view, again, that clearly links very closely with planning. We deal with quite a lot of regeneration work. We've got a lot of projects underway at the moment of all shapes and sizes. So some of the smaller stuff are things around car parks and new play areas, and then working up through some of our town centre schemes. So a good example of a project which is underway at the moment is the Kettering Heritage Action Zone, where we have money from Historic England to fund a series of things, including public realm regeneration work in Kettering Town Centre, but also a series of cultural events as well, which aim to raise awareness of the history and the culture of Kettering. So sort of two aspects to that particular scheme. Excuse me. And there are a whole load of other regeneration schemes which are in various stages of progress. So another one, for example, is Wellingborough Town Centre regeneration proposals, proposals around the station quarter in Kettering, and indeed, as you may be aware, the Corby Town Fund, where we've just received almost £20 million worth of funding, which will deliver a series of projects across Corby Town Centre. So lots of good work going on there. From an economic development point of view, well, again, that kind of is what you might expect it to be. It's a series of things around supporting town centres, supporting local businesses, attracting inward investment into the area. Particularly relevant at the moment, and I'll talk a little bit more about it slightly later on, is the work that we're doing to support economic recovery across Northamptonshire. So lots of good work going on there. Digital infrastructure is another service where we are the lead authority. So it's delivered sort of under the banner of Superfast Northamptonshire. And again, this is focused on improving the rollout of not just superfast broadband, but obviously a full fibre network and gigabit infrastructure now. And again, there's a little bit to talk about that later on as well. Climate change, probably don't need to touch on that too much because that's going to be a real focus of this particular panel and the work done through that. Finally, flood risk management. This was a former county council service which has been disaggregated, and unfortunately, rather like our climate change staff, we've also inherited a flood risk management team without much resource. However, we have arrangement in place with our colleagues in West Northamptonshire who do have some resource, and they're assisting us over the course of this year until we're in a position to be able to recruit to a new team. And we have lots of other contracts in place through, for example, Keir WSP and the Bedford Internal Drainage Board. So work is done through those channels as well. That includes things like consultation responses to all planning applications in relation to flood risk, investigations into flooding events, and also seeking funding and then delivering capital project schemes that achieve flood alleviation and those kind of things. I'll probably leave it there and hand back to George to carry on.
Thanks, Rob. So moving seamlessly on to Jonathan.
Thanks, George, and morning, councillors and all. I'm Jonathan Waterworth. I'm the Assistant Director for Assets and Environment. So the key services are detailed in front of you on this slide. Starting on the left-hand side with the functions shaded orange, they're principally functions that were carried out by both the former district and borough councils and the county councils. They're functions now that are coming together under one umbrella. And then the functions on the right-hand side, coloured green and blue. The green are the areas that are principally covered by districts and boroughs, and the blue by the county council, so areas that we're looking to perhaps bring together. And the areas that are edged in the blue shade are hosted services, so services that are run by or provided by West Northamptonshire Council, with a link into us in terms of how those services are delivered. So if I start with facilities management, property estate management, energy management and capital projects, sort of taking those as a group because they all interlink in terms of what they deliver. So they're really about keeping our property estate maintained, safe and legal, and ensuring that we're using our estate to support service delivery, generating income, or indeed supporting the local economy. We do have a significant property estate. And I'll touch on that in the areas of focus section in terms of the size and some of the challenges that our estate presents us. But those functions were all undertaken slightly differently by the former councils, and part of the challenge over the next few months is really about bringing those teams together in terms of how they operate and trying to align some of those processes over the coming months. And then similarly, just picking up on fleet vehicles at the bottom of that first list. This covers the council's transport needs in terms of everything from vans for wardens, pool cars for staff, grounds and waste vehicles, and then their maintenance. And as I said before, a similar theme. There's a mixture of delivery in terms of that service, in terms of in-house maintenance and lease arrangements, contract arrangements in terms of the vehicles are looked after by external contractors. So again, it's a similar theme in terms of looking at a consistent approach in terms of how the council looks after its fleet going forward. And then moving to the top right of the list, you've got their grounds maintenance, parks and open spaces and country parks, and sort of taking those as a group again. it's really about maintaining and developing our natural environment for residents and importantly, nature. Those spaces have become a really important part of people's lives over the last year. And it's really important we think proactively about how we might use those spaces to support residents' use, but also the climate change agenda and really developing those spaces. And again, mixture of ways those services are delivered. So taking grounds, that's an in-house service in terms of the Corby and Kettering patches, and then elsewhere contract and joint venture arrangements. And then country parks, the council is North Northampton Council, that is the lead authority for our 5 country parks spread across the county as a whole. So really we'll be looking at options about how we might start to integrate some of those services across the board, and also considering a consistent policy position. Councillor Fedorovich raised about the use of pesticides, and it's important we look at that holistically and that consistent approach across the north in terms of how we put those policy positions in place. And then picking up on car parking and also on-street parking enforcement. So we've got a number of town and local centre car parks, which are clearly delivering an important local need in terms of supporting local economies. And again, that function spread across a number of different teams presently. And we will be looking, I'll touch on it in the next stage, in terms of how we manage those car parks holistically and focused on local needs. The parking enforcement side is actually hosted by West Northampton Council, although in Kettering we have a slightly different model in terms of that enforcement being by an in-house team who cover a number of other services. And then last but not least, archive service. This is hosted by West Northampton Council. And again, we will be looking at those arrangements and how we look at disaggregating that service over the coming months and years in terms of that arrangement, given the importance of what's stored there. It is quite important we get the right approach in terms of how we look at how that service is delivered going forward. So they were my key functions and brief intro. If I hand back to, I believe Ian's next. If you go to the next slide.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ian Smith. I'm the Assistant Director for Regulatory Services. Nice to meet you all. Yeah, so there's a similar theme here in terms of how the slides have been set out. So we've got a grouping of functions within regulatory services, some of which were provided previously by Northamptonshire County Council, which are largely the services shown on the left-hand side in the blue box. So that's trading standards, emergency planning, which is a hosted service in the north. So that service is provided for West Northamptonshire and North Northamptonshire by North Northamptonshire. And similarly with the Travellers Unit, that's a service that's hosted in North Northamptonshire and provides a service for West and North. So those are the county council functions that have come across into regulatory services on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, in the green box, you've got the district and borough functions that were previously carried out by those authorities. So we've got a number of functions there, which I'll come on to say a little bit more about in terms of environment, health, licensing, etc., as shown. And then in the bottom box, there's some cross-cutting services that clearly were provided in relation to both the previous county council and the sovereign district and borough councils, which is largely around business continuity planning. So saying a little bit really more about what those services involve in terms of starting sort of on the left-hand side with trading standards. As I say, that was largely previously an NCC function. Clearly it's a relatively small team of officers, 10 officers, etc. There's a service that's been disaggregated west and north. So the north function constitutes a team of 10. The focus of that is really around effectively feedstuffs enforcement, product safety, consumer protection type functions, and dealing with sort of scams and things like that. They do work quite closely with citizens' advice around issues to do with consumer advice. Previously based at Wootton Hall Park, but they will be moving to Dean House in the north to co-locate with some of the Environment Health Services on the right-hand side in August, so in a few weeks' time. Then moving on to emergency planning, clearly that's about how the council organise itself in terms of responding to emergency incidents and supporting largely the blue light services in terms of responding to those incidents, particularly in terms of type provision of sort of recovery type arrangements in terms of rest centres, but equally and very importantly in terms of planning for incidents that might occur. So there's a number of different plans that are produced by emergency planning that we have to have by statute. Some example of those that we've run out recently is that clearly we had a plan a Forth Bridge, which dealt with the sort of death of the Duke of Edinburgh. So that's the latest sort of emergency plan that we had in place that we've effectively activated and worked to in relation to a real-time incident. But there are numerous other plans that we have that are largely related to the community risk register around issues to do with excess deaths, flood, cyber attacks, terrorism, etc., etc. And through emergency planning, we also work quite closely with the local resilience forum, which is clearly a forum that where all stakeholders that have got an interest in the community risk and resilience planning come together. So that's all your blue light services, the local authorities, West and North, the Environment Agency, etc. So moving on down to the Travellers Unit, clearly that's a function that largely deals with unauthorised encampments of travellers on highway and public land across North Northamptonshire and West Northamptonshire, and liaises quite closely with the police as the key stakeholder in managing that type of issue, and sort of going out visiting travellers, basically assessing needs around issues to do with health needs and such like, and then going through the process through the courts, etc., to actually move travellers on where they are on some public land and are basically causing concerns. So moving across on to the right hand side, in terms of the district and borough functions, we've got environmental health. Largely that's involved in terms of delivering services around inspecting businesses, giving advice, enforcing regulations that relate to issues around food safety. So basically we're dealing with food complaints, inspecting food businesses, sampling foods from food businesses, etc., and issues to do with health and safety. Environment health enforce health and safety in a large array of businesses, probably more so more businesses than the health and safety executive. So all retail, leisure, warehousing and distribution sector is enforced in terms of health and safety for environmental health. So we're also investigating accidents and complaints in relation to workplace safety through environmental health. Then clearly there's a significant sector around licensing. So that's licensing really of all premises and vehicles, quite wide ranging in terms of liquor licensing, entertainment, gambling, hire vehicles in terms of private hire and hackney carriages, and all sorts of animal welfare type issues around pet shops, dog breeding, and things such as skin piercing, etc. So it's quite diverse in terms of its range. Bereavement Services, that's a sort of a collective in relation to cemetery grounds and basically crematoria. We have 2 crematoria within North Northamptonshire, one within the direct management and control of the council at Warren Hill in Kettering, and one that's run as a sort of arm's length company from the council, which is Nen Valley Crematorium, which is the crematorium in Wellingborough. We also have a number of closed churchyards that we manage as well by way of bereavement services. Then moving to building control, clearly that's a function that's largely looking around ensuring that new build premises comply with the building regulations, meeting certain standards around energy efficiency, and there's also an enforcement aspect to that service that deals with issues such as dangerous structures and buildings. It is a service that competes with the private sector in terms of the fact that we have to compete with private sectors. So we have to ensure private inspectors, sorry. So we have to ensure that we're competitive in terms of our offer, and we have to ensure that we market ourselves appropriately. And it is a significant income earner within regulatory services, as are bereavement services and licensing also. And then lastly, in the green box, we've got local land charges. Basically, anybody who's sold a house or a property will be familiar with the fact that you have to undertake a search as part of that sale. And that's largely what local land charges do. They process those personal and standard property searches in order that effectively property sales can continue. And then just moving down to the bottom in terms of business continuity planning, clearly that's a function that's been brought together between both what was the county council and the districts and boroughs. That's largely planning how the organisation prioritises its services and how it responds to business interruption incidents, which might occur from fire, flood, cyber attack, etc., and how it sort of might prioritise those functions in terms of their recovery. So what we look at is across the council in terms of what certain critical functions we might have, such as adult social care, homelessness, emergency repairs, sort of bin collections, etc., and how we would seek to recover those services in a managed way in the event of a business interruption incident. So that's pretty much what regulatory services is about. The sole focus is really focused on public safety and consumer protection, and basically responding to resilience issues in terms of emergency planning and business continuity planning. So I think that concludes the overview of the services for place and economy, and I'll hand you back to George at this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Chair, I think Councillor Lee has a hand up. I'm not sure whether you want to take some questions now before we. I'm conscious that's taken quite a bit of time. I think it just demonstrates the breadth of what we've got potentially covering this particular panel, but quite happy to pause through you, Chair, and take any questions.
Yeah, and thank you for those presentations. They were really informative. Yes, Councillor Lee, you had your hand up for quite a while, so happy to take for you to ask your question.
Thank you very much. Can I ask that we get these presentations in advance so that we can annotate them on our smart devices, because that would be good. But my main point is climate change. That's an interesting comment from Rob Harbour, who's got a very extensive portfolio already. I don't need to cover that because it will be covered we will talk about it here. It looks to me as if climate change is just tagged on to a very busy portfolio already. No resources, there's absolutely no money set aside in the budget for it. The officers have left with all the expertise. Maybe we are recruiting some officers, but I don't know how long that will take. I find it hard to believe that we are taking climate change seriously, because we don't just want to be a talk shop. It's not because we discuss it here that it doesn't then need to be implemented. We already have a ready-made action plan, but without resources and without officers, we cannot lobby for government funding, and we cannot implement anything. That's my view. Thank you.
Councillor Allibone, you've got your hand up as well. If we take that quickly as well, and then we can.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just a couple of points reference Graham Kane's remarks about the waste contracts, because although Wellingborough's is probably the one that finishes first, March 22, a lot of the others are going off into the distance. Veolia, I think, took the contract from the old Northampton Borough. Daventry got a 1, 2, 3 system. So the challenge is going to be all ending up with a clean sheet of paper at the same time. And I think that is quite a considerable challenge. And very briefly, on his comments on fly tipping, and as a cereal farmer in the county, I know probably as much about this as anybody. We've got about $1 million a year now that have been reported that costs tens of millions to deal with. And I think it's really down to government to support local government, central government to support local government, in that the legislation has simply got to get more, it's got to get tighter. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Liz. Sorry.
we could probably pick the responses to those points made by Councillor Lee and Councillor Allibone when we go through the next set of slides, I think.
Yeah, I think that would be good to do with some other items where we can discuss that. But
yeah, we'll try and speed up, because I'm conscious these next 4 slides will stimulate the debate, I think, amongst members around, if you like, those future areas of focus. So I'll pass back to Jonathan through you, Chair, just to and then on to the other ADs, and I'll just ask perhaps Rob and Graham just to pick up those points that were raised by Councillor Lee and Councillor Allibone when we get to their slides. Okay, over to you, Jonathan.
Yep, thanks, George. Right, so key priorities for the next year and onwards, because a lot of these objectives will take time to review and put together a strategy and implement. But starting with asset review and strategy, so we have as a council over 2,000 assets. They range from multi-million-pound investments right down to highway verges and small pocket parks. Assets can be expensive, particularly buildings, and it's really important in terms of this objective that we build up an understanding of why we own property and test what purpose it is providing. So whether that's a community function, a service delivery, or an investment property. And it's really important we consider the cost, but also as part of that, the environmental impact and alternative uses for our properties. And this first action really links strongly with the second in terms of the accommodation strategy. So this is about how our own buildings are used for delivering our services. So, and there's a multitude of factors to consider in respect of the accommodation strategy in terms of customer location, partner opportunities, and the future of work debate, which is taking place in terms of how we work as an agile workforce, but also adopting some of the lessons we learned over the last year in terms of how we can work and how we adopt some of those going forward. But again, an important factor in this is running costs, but in particular energy use and the sustainability of our buildings, and looking at the life cycle costs in terms of how much it will cost to run these facilities over a number of years. And it's really important that we ensure that climate change and our carbon footprint and how we reduce and address that is at the centre of those considerations. And I suppose it's not just about vacating and selling on stock that we don't perhaps need anymore. It's about how we look at improving the energy use and carbon footprint of those buildings in terms of actually improving that rather than selling it on as somebody using it perhaps in the same sort of way, and there'd be no environmental benefit in respect of that. But these two actions are a significant piece of work. They'll take time to gather the data, consider it, put together a strategy, and then of course implement it. Would take some time, but really important in terms of how we move forward as a council. And then moving on to grounds maintenance and country parks, again, as I mentioned, there's a mixture of service delivery option or service delivery currently. It's important that we review each, but consider the environmental value of those arrangements. So it's not just about grass cutting. There's a planting maintenance regimes in terms of improving biodiversity, highway verge cutting schemes, which was mentioned earlier, in terms of encouraging wildflowers and bees. And of course, tree planting opportunities, which is a really important piece of work to look at in terms over the next year, in terms of how we make that a consistent approach across the north. And then country parks, I've mentioned that they are become a big part of people's lives over the last year, and it's really important we look at how we maintain that public interest in those parks and develop those further. Moving on to car parking strategy, the council owns a significant number of town centre car parks, as I've mentioned, each with different charging regimes, and we really need to consider those arrangements in the context of the financial impact, economic impact, and the needs of those local centres. And it's really an important opportunity to consider how they might form part of the council strategy for encouraging more sustainable modes of transport. So looking at e-transport hubs and really sort of, I suppose, looking at our car parks differently to perhaps how they've been looked at in the past. And then fleet, again, I've mentioned this, but just, you know, it's a big part of the council's carbon footprint, and how we adopt green technology and electric vehicles, and looking at the infrastructure behind those as a council in terms of as we operate is an important piece of work. And then finally, the investment strategy. We own a significant commercial estate, let alone our operational estate. So our commercial estate brings in over £17 million in rent each year, which clearly helps the council in terms of service delivery. But there's also the energy side to that, in terms of there's increasingly stringent energy performance targets for our buildings. And I suppose as a landlord, we have an opportunity to influence how those buildings are operated, and you know, the sustainability of that commercial estate is improved. That was very briefly my key objectives. There's clearly others across the service, but I was trying to pull out some key ones that fitted with the focus of this group. So happy to hand back to George for the next slide.
Yeah, thanks. Again, through you, Chair. Should we just run through these and then open up for questions and debate?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, so back to Graham.
Thanks very much. So yeah, some key points for me, some high level areas that we'll be looking at this year and into next. First of all, is the bus strategy. So government came up with their own national bus strategy a couple of months ago. You may have had the opportunity to look at that. They are clearly keen to try and reinvigorate the bus services across the country. And they have laid that task down to local government to deliver on that ambition and those objectives. So in line with that, the executive yesterday approved our process to go forward to develop a bus strategy, and more importantly, a bus improvement plan, which is a plan that we come up with the bus sector. So we engage with voluntary providers of public transport, but also commercial providers of public transport, and we come up with an improvement plan together. So there will be certain commitments on them, and there'll be certain commitments on us, all aimed to try and promote bus travel and to make it easier for people to use buses as an alternative. So we will develop the bus improvement plan, and also what we do is we enter into what's called an enhanced partnership between the bus providers. So that path that is now laid down by that approval of that report yesterday, and we will continue with that work. Then we've got the next one, a strategy to tackle litter. I know fine well this is an important matter for all residents, and no doubt therefore you hear a lot about this. As I was saying earlier, we do a great deal to try and keep the areas clean and keep on top of the litter that is created across the area that we look after. We also support voluntary groups and so forth. So this strategy is really pulling all that together. The enforcement side of it, the awareness raising side of it, our own activities, and supporting voluntary groups as well. So we're developing a strategy. We'd like to bring that to the executive during the summertime. So I'd like to, through the chair, I'd like to suggest that we bring that to this forum so that you have the opportunity to consider it and discuss it before it goes on to the executive for hopefully their approval and support. So more on that in due course if you're interested in it. And picking up on Councillor Allarbone's point as well, fly tipping is clearly closely related to this as well. And clearly we've got another, again, activities around that in terms of clearing it, where we've got responsibility for it on public land, but also carrying out enforcement activity. And our officers go through fly tipping, literally go through it with a pair of gloves, and they look for evidence of where it might have originated from. And then we follow that lead back to try and tackle the root cause, and where appropriate to enforce through the issuing of tickets, or indeed taking individuals or companies to court where that's appropriate as well. So we do that all the time. Highways procurement, we're going through a highways procurement exercise at the moment. So our current KWSP contract, which is delivered through the West, you'll recall, comes to an end in March next year. So we're in the process of procuring a new one. We will have our own contract for the north, so we will separate from the west and have our own contract for the north. That's a very intense, complex process to re-procure a highways contract. So we are in the thick of it right now, and we're continuing that work. Within the procurement, there is a requirement for the bidders to demonstrate how they will consider the impacts on environment and protect the environment where they can, including, of course, climate change as well. So we have included that within the criteria and the evaluation process for those bidders. In terms of future recycling services, as I highlighted earlier, we have slightly different arrangements in different areas. As you were saying, Councillor Allibone, we do have sort of a slightly fragmented process here. Obviously, Northampton and Daventry are no longer our concern. That's for the West to sort out. But we do have the Kettering and Corby model where it's in-house. Then we have a contract, as I said earlier, with FCC and Wellingborough North. We do have the opportunity as of next year to ask the executive what they want to do about the Wellingborough North. But potentially next year or within the next year or 18 months, we could look at bringing 3 of those services all in one delivery model. And then we would just have East North Hants as a separate delivery model until the end of their contract in 2025. So we do have the opportunity to start aligning things more closely. The collection arrangements are slightly different. They're much the same. There's not huge disparity between the way that it's operated, but not all areas have food waste collection at the moment on a weekly basis. And our garden waste collection is delivered slightly differently. There's a charge for service in East North Hants, whereas it's free in the other 3. So there is some alignment and harmonisation to work through. So I would have thought this group would be interested in that. Also, the government is progressing with its own consultation around consistency of recycling. This is an old age dilemma in that local authorities collect things differently. They collect different materials. They ask residents to do different things with those materials, and they give slightly different advice. And government has tried to tackle this for a long time, and they've got a consultation out at the moment looking at how we could make it more consistent across the country to make it easier for residents, easier for the industry, and ultimately to drive up recycling rates. So we're engaging with that consultation at the moment. There's particular questions around food waste and the requirement for weekly food waste collections, and also a question around whether or not garden waste collections should be free of charge to the resident. So we're engaging with that, and that will inform and influence ultimately, I would have thought, what the executive decides to do with recycling collections across Northamptonshire. And then I mentioned earlier as well, active travel. This is an important area for us. We are keen to ensure that we get as much funding from DFT for cycling and walking. Hence, we are developing the local cycling and walking infrastructure plans. Some of them are in train, others we are intending to progress later on this year. We do have some capacity funding from DFT to do that, which is great. So that enables us to progress those more quickly than we otherwise would have done. And again, I'm sure that this group will have an interest in that point as well. So like Jonathan, those are some high-level areas where we thought you'd have a particular interest as we move forward.
Thanks, Graham. And moving swiftly on to Ian.
Yeah, thank you, George. Through yourself, Chair, I'll be brief because I'm aware time is pressing. So some of the, equally for regulatory services, some of the sort of key priorities for this year going into next. At the top of the list there, we've got a hire vehicle licensing policy reviews. Currently, we're working to 4 distinct sort of sovereign areas licensing policies, which are still legally sound, but what we need to move to as soon as possible. Set of Northamptonshire's policies around conditions for drivers, vehicles and operators, a fares setting policy and structure, and fees and charges wrapped around that service. It's probably likely to be maybe one of the more contentious areas for regulatory services in terms of policies, and will probably generate some significant political interest and certainly feedback from the local trade. And that's something clearly that we're keen to get on with. We have actually done some work around this already, but there's still quite a lot of work left to do with a view to trying to get something out to consultation with the trade at some point over the summer period. Moving down the list, we've got emergency planning disaggregation there. Emergency planning as a hosted service, as per the blueprint, was on a timetable to be looked at for disaggregation by the end of the financial year. along with a number of other projects that were on that blueprint list for disaggregation. Those are currently going through review with the business transformation team, with a view to reviewing whether the timing of that disaggregation of those services is still feels right, and looking at also what other options there might be around whether those services should disaggregate or not, in terms of whether it makes good business sense to do so. So clearly there's some work that we're working through at the moment in relation to that, to understand what the best approach is with respect to the emergency planning service going forward and its future disaggregation. With respect to regulatory services business support, I think that's something where I clearly think there's a real opportunity there for Northamptonshire to put together something a bit more bespoke in relation to how we might support businesses going forward. What we've been able to do previously, working as distinct districts and boroughs in the county council, has been somewhat more fragmented. I think this is probably more important than ever, given some of the pressures business have faced in terms of COVID and trying to come out of COVID in terms of COVID recovery. So that's really all about trying to put together a bespoke package of services for businesses around advice, training, signposting and consultancy type support through regulatory services to try and encourage business startups, business transformation and diversification and growth. Traveller unit review of policy and operation. As I've said, the Traveller unit's a hosted service for the North, provided North and West. Previously, its governance was via an executive board with 7 effectively partner authorities. Clearly, that's not the case going forward. We've now effectively just got West and North in terms of 2 partner authorities. So the whole sort of set of policies and governance around that is requiring review. And that's something that we're in the throes of doing currently. And once we effectively are able to review the policies and sort out the executive governance in the short term, then clearly there's a piece of work that needs to be done about reviewing the future operation and opportunities of the unit and how it might operate going forward more effectively, and particularly in terms of how it might interact with the police in terms of police liaison, to make sure that in effect we are engaging and working with the police in the most effective way possible to sort of manage issues around travellers both in North Northamptonshire and West Northamptonshire. I said in terms of the overview about business continuity, we've been successful in already getting agreement to a business continuity strategy with the shadow executive in February or March, but there's a lot of work still to do around this in terms of translating that strategy into a workable action plan, in terms of effectively reviewing where we're at with respect to business continuity planning across the sovereign districts and boroughs and what was previously the county council, reviewing what the critical functions will be for the new North Northamptonshire Council, and basically how services would respond in a business interruption incident in relation to those critical incidents, making sure those plans are fit for purpose, and testing those plans really, which is all part of the requirements around business continuity. So that's something clearly we need to move forward for the next period, run into this year and running into next year. And then it'd be remiss of me not to really mention the COVID response and recovery, because that's clearly had a significant impact on the functions within regulatory services. There's a lot of resources that's been put into the COVID response, from trading standards, emergency planning, environmental health, and clearly that's had an impact in terms of issues around business as usual. So whilst we're sort of trying to plan for COVID recovery and emerging out of the COVID response, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done about trying to get things back in terms of business as usual, whilst understanding there's still requirements for us to service in terms of the COVID response, particularly around sort of business advice and support, compliance monitoring, enforcement, surge testing, etc. So that's sort of what we foresee the key priorities are within my service area for regulatory services. Thank you. I think that handing on to Rob, who's the last of us in terms of his priorities.
Thanks, Ian. So going through, I talked briefly before about economic recovery. It's obviously very important right now in terms of the North Northants economy. We're in the process of producing an economic recovery framework. George talked a little bit earlier about co-designing and co-producing some of our important policies and strategies with key stakeholders, and this is one where we will be doing exactly that over the next month and a half. The main thrust of the framework is likely to be about, for a start, ensuring that we're properly engaged and aligned with other key sort of stakeholders and partners like SEMLEP, who have their own economic recovery strategy. It'll be about issues like ensuring that we have a clear pathway for inward investment of business into Northamptonshire, about ensuring that we can support and what's the word I'm looking for? Encourage the right kind of environment for startup businesses. So that's things like having the availability of flexible business space, which we do through some of our hubs and enterprise centres. Clearly, we're working on business support grants at the moment. Part of that's mandatory, being done by colleagues in revenues and benefits, but also through the economic development team who are dealing with discretionary grants to businesses and hardship funding as well. There's business support where we work with the University of Northampton and the SEMLEP Growth Hub to help to support local businesses, and then thinking about individuals in terms of those that may be seeking to either get back into work or into work for the first time if they've just left education, for example. So again, that's working with partners around things like fast track job match and careers fairs and so on and so forth. And then also thinking about our own town centres across Northamptonshire and ensuring that we create an environment across those town centres that encourage residents and visitors back into those town centres and help to support local businesses that are situated within them. And a part of how we do that will be through a programme of projects delivered through the Welcome Back Fund. And again, the sort of co-design element there has been through discussion with a number of town councils in terms of what they would like to see in the town centres through that fund. Integrated growth strategy kind of links in, but this is more about developing our long-term growth strategy for Northamptonshire. That's going to be extremely important because that obviously will help to set the vision and the direction that we wish to take across Northants in terms of growth. The integrated part of that is again about this co-design and co-produced element of it, working with our key stakeholders to produce that strategy. The strategic plan is slightly different. I touched upon it earlier. It's effectively the review of the joint course strategy, the Northampton joint course strategy, which is 5 years old this year, and so we will need to develop a new strategic plan that sets out our key planning policies across Northamptonshire going forward. And importantly, there will be a number of elements within that feed into and contribute towards climate change and the environment in terms of what those policies say around the provision of green and blue infrastructure, around what we do in terms of energy efficiency in buildings and design quality, and all those kind of things have a number of positive benefits in terms of climate change and the environment. Next is climate change, and I'm going to pick up at this point here on the comments made by Councillor Lee. At the start of the meeting, Councillor Lee asked a particularly pointed question. It was directed in relation to the attendance of two particular officers that had helped out with the task and finish group, and I answered that question on that basis in relation to those two particular officers. So at the moment we are short. We're short in terms of a climate change team, but that team will lead on the development of policies and strategies. The reality of climate change within this organisation is that it is overarching, and it's incumbent upon all areas of the council to adopt and embed climate change policies and thinking within whatever they do. And therefore I see that although the two members of staff which are not there at the moment and leaves us with a bit of a capacity shortfall, doesn't actually prevent us from taking forward a number of elements. And you've heard about that actually in the presentation this morning. Jonathan's talked about some of the initiatives around biodiversity and pollination. He's also talked about stuff to do with energy efficiency within our own asset portfolio. Graham's touched upon things around sustainable transport and also waste and recycling. Through the work that we're doing around the strategic plan, we're on the verge of commissioning some background work in terms of evidence base on climate and climate change that will feed into those strategic policies. We're also, through other parts of the authority who aren't represented today. So, for example, within housing and communities, they're working on the LAD2 project, which is around reducing fuel poverty for our residents. We're also in some discussions around exploring heat networking in Corby. And we're working through planning and economic development with the two energy parks that we have, Kettering Energy Park, in terms of master planning that and bringing that forward to ensure that they deliver the solar farms and start to produce the output in terms of renewable energy that was always envisaged from that park. And we're working alongside Chelveston Renewable Energy Park to support the innovative work that they're doing in terms of green energy technology and ensuring that that's really well linked into SEMLEP and also the development work of the Oxcam ARC. So there is a lot of good climate change work which is already being undertaken, and it's not reliant upon those two members of staff that we talked about earlier on. That's because it, as I say, is incumbent upon all areas of the authority to work and to embed a culture that takes account of climate change across the organisation. The reason I said what I did in relation to slide 1 on climate change was very simply that A, we're pushed for time, but secondly, climate change is a key focus of this particular panel, and it is something which we won't just touch upon and play lip service to. I'm absolutely sure of that. And I think because it's an issue where actually we'll go into significant detail in terms of the work that's coming forward through the authority that contributes towards carbon reduction and so on and so forth, that actually it wasn't, I didn't feel it was something to actually talk about in detail in relation to that particular slide. In no way belittles the importance of climate change or the significant amount of work that we'll need to do in relation to it. Moving on, something which has sort of cropped up relatively recently, but will be extremely important to North Northampton Council, is the Central Area Growth Deal. This is about a potential deal with government. It links into the Oxcam ARC, of which we are a part and will play a role. And it effectively is the start of a negotiation on a deal with government where hopefully we will identify a number of asks which might be in part financial around financial investment in infrastructure. And I talked a little bit earlier on about infrastructure provision and funding gaps. and the importance of trying to close those, but it might also be about some freedoms and flexibilities to enable us to operate in a certain way within Northampton, the wider arc, that perhaps other areas of the country don't benefit from. So that's a really important piece of work, needs to be done fairly quickly. So it's on a very fast turnaround there, because the government, I think, are hoping to align that with the autumn spending review. We are currently involved in the Community Renewal Fund. That's government funding which is being channeled through local authorities, and we've a list of 20 odd projects which we've just submitted to government for their approval. It covers a whole range of things, including investment in things like the Greenway and some of our green and blue infrastructure around the Nen Valley to support the visitor economy, amongst lots of other things. And coming up fairly shortly after that will be the Levelling Up Fund, which is an opportunity for us to bid into government. We've a series of opportunities to bid for key projects with political backing that we'd like to see taken forward across Northamptonshire. So there are obviously timeframes attached to that work, and that's going to be a key piece of work for us to move forward this year. And then finally, I think digital infrastructure. I mentioned earlier on that we're the lead authority for digital infrastructure. There are three key elements to the work that the team there undertake. Part of it's around encouraging commercial investment by existing and new providers in telecom and internet service. It's also about identifying and addressing areas of market failure in digital infrastructure across Northamptonshire, and it's then about bringing forward solutions to the coverage where there is market failure through publicly funded support to do that. So government funded support in digital infrastructure provision. And of course, all those things, and we talked about this right at the start of the meeting in terms of reference when we debated holding these meetings virtually and the positive impact that can have on CO2 reduction. So digital infrastructure, important in that respect, but also in terms of the digital economy and ensuring that we've got the right kind of infrastructure in place to be able to support that fast-growing sector of the economy. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I think that concludes. Members will be pleased to know all of the slides. So I'll pass back to yourself, Chair.
Thank you. And again, thank you for running all that through that with detail. We have got a couple of questions. I think if we can quickly take them, because I'm conscious we do want to get onto discussion as well. So Councillor Bone.
Thanks, Chair. I think mine is more of an observation, really. I've got multiple questions, and that's the problem. It's an observation, really. I think it's a bit closing the gate after the horse has bolted. And I think Councillor Lee possibly suggested it at the beginning. For me personally, it would have been helpful to perhaps have these presentations beforehand, because I've got multiple questions. I don't know in which order to pose the questions, so I don't think I'll bother, because we haven't got a lot of time, and perhaps I'll just email the individual officers. But it's, my question was right from the beginning to do with waste, and that was, some time ago. So I appreciate the officers' presentations, but I think I'm definitely going to listen back on the recording that's been made, because so many questions have arisen, and that's the whole point of debate, isn't it? I suppose it has one question thrown up other questions. Can I just quickly mention the fly tipping one? I think I'm sure most of us have been working on that for years and years, and I just quite like our strategy to be more proactive with enforcement, because I've been to so many different meetings and discussions where we have education in place, we have all sorts of strategies, but actually ultimately, unless you enforce, we're going to be talking about this in 5-6 years' time. But my observation is it would have been nice to have had those presentations, and I will listen to them again because they've been very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bone, and certainly we take on board that as well. I think we're kind of finding our feet a little bit this first one, so hopefully we can get, you know, a nice smooth operation going forward. Councillor Lee, quickly.
It is a proposal because that is what this panel is supposed to do, put recommendations to the executive. So my recommendation is this panel, and the full name, recommends that the executive allocates an adequate budget for officers dealing exclusively with climate change, including gathering key data on Northamptonshire Council's performance, raising awareness and lobbying for government funding, because the officers are trying to do an amazing job and manage an extensive portfolio with very few resources. So as councillors, I feel we have a duty to provide them with the necessary resources. So benchmarking at the start is important, but providing those officers is also important, and with the necessary resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, and take on board what you've said there. I know that they're looking to get those officers in place as quickly as possible. So take on board what you've said. And
well, can we vote on? Sorry, Chair. Can we vote on that, please? We only have a few minutes left, so that we have a recommendation to put to the. I can put it in the chat. My recommendation.
Chair, if I may, and I'll take a steer from Democratic Services. We can advise as a panel, but it wouldn't necessarily be a recommendation as such. It would be comments coming from and that would be going through the executive member, which is Councillor Pentland, obviously to feed back into the executive. So I hope that, and this is where we've got this sort of, we observe, this meeting doesn't broadly observe the Local Government Act 1972, but it observes it in the spirit of that act, if that makes sense. So hopefully that makes sense. But this
no,
is
so we cannot put recommendations to the executive. Then I thought that was the aim of this committee.
I think this panel it's an advisory panel. So if the panel wants to make a point through the portfolio holder that it was the panel's view that it was sufficiently resourced, then obviously that can be taken on board by the executive. That's my understanding. I'll check in with Raj though as the Democratic Service. Is that your understanding, Raj?
Yeah, George, that's my understanding as well, that we can pass comments through the chair to the executive. Similar to what you said.
Yeah.
Thank you. And just to go in on, expand on that, you know, I'm really keen to have this feedback, and I have made a note of what you said. And if you could perhaps email me in the detail, the wording you've said, I will feed that back. You know, if you go to page 136 of the Constitution for the Council, it gives some more information about the executive advisory panels, which will be useful. But as I say, I'm all ears and I'm here to listen and make the best of this. That's what we want to do, and go about it in the right way. Thank you. So I think if we haven't got any questions for a second, we should move on to item 7 quickly, which looks at the forthcoming executive papers. George? Yeah, so
there's 3 that are coming to the executive on the 15th of July, and I'll ask the ADs just to give literally a 1-minute overview of each of them. There's a lease renewal at Corby Innovation Centre. There's approval of Section 106 monies to improve part of the road network adjacent to a fairly large housing development in Kettering, and there's a further update on the highways procurement work. If we take those in that order, Jonathan, do you want to just give a high-level overview of the first paper, then on to Rob, and then on to Graham?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, George. Yeah, so the report going to exec on the 15th relating to Corby Innovation Hub is a proposal for a lease renewal for a commercial tenant that occupies space there. So just by way of background, the building is about a 60,000 square foot commercial property that the council owns that offers office and industrial premises. The tenant's been in situ since 2015. Their lease expires this year, and we have been successful in reaching an agreement for a new tenancy at the building. And indeed, the tenant is expanding their occupancy, so it includes his offices 1, 4, and 12. So they're expanded to about 12,000 square foot on site. So that will be our largest tenant in the building. They present a significant amount of income for the council each year in terms of rental income, but also they are a significant employer in the town. So important for the local economy that we continue to secure tenants and local employers in our buildings. So due to the terms being commercially sensitive, they don't form part of the report, but there will be an exempt appendix that details the terms that the council is proposing to sign up to. Happy to take any questions on the report, but that's a high-level overview.
Thank you. And then have we got the next one that was on that list?
Yeah, I think that was me, Chair. So this is a report going to executive in relation to the Hanwood Park Sustainable Urban Extension. So this is a housing development of some 5,500 homes for primary schools, a secondary school, employment, and lots of public open space, etc., etc., etc. So the development is well underway, and at certain points, as it's built out, there are a need to carry out what are called off-site junction improvements. So these are improvements to junctions on the highway network, the existing highway network, to ensure that as the houses are built and more traffic comes onto the roads, that those junctions are altered so that they're capable of dealing with increased volume of traffic that will inevitably flow through them. So as the houses are built, the authority collects in Section 106 money from them, and that Section 106 money, or a part of it, is then earmarked to pay for those junction improvements. So effectively, the developer is paying us, and we then pay a contractor, in this case, this is in-house, as it were, through Northamptonshire Highways Kier WSP, to improve 2 junctions, which imaginatively are known as junctions D and D. But they are 2 of 17, I think, off-site junctions that require improvement through the lifespan of the project. So this is just seeking approval to put the Section 106 money to that use, and to ensure that those 2 junction improvement capital projects feed into the capital programme.
Thank you. And I think we've got one more.
Thank you. Yes, very quickly, mindful of everyone's time. The Highways Procurement Project, as I said, has been going on for some time. It started under the County Council, very much in conjunction with the former districts and boroughs. This is an opportunity to update the executive on progress, and to ensure we've got the relevant delegations in place to continue with the Highways Procurement exercise. So that's what will be going to executive.
Thank you. So it is 11:30. We've still got an important agenda item to go with. So if people are able to stay on, I hope we'll be able to continue this meeting for a little while so we can get on to that. Is there anybody that needs to leave at this point? It doesn't look like it. So that's good. So if we move to item 8, which is the discussion on developing the forward plan for the climate change EAP. I think, George, your name's against this.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I suppose it's really for obviously members have heard a lot of information, and I absolutely take on board the point that Councillor Bone was making, and we will get into a rhythm and ensuring that we get information out in advance for members to see, because I appreciate there was some information on the slide deck, which a lot of it was brought to life by colleagues in the room. But I accept that it's always helpful to have that in advance. So that's a point well made, and we will ensure that happens going forward. I suppose the reason we did all of that, or the thinking behind the reason doing all of that, is so that it was a sort of quite a rapid overview of, if you like, the remit of this particular panel, and then sharing with you, if you like, some of those key areas that, as officers, and I do stress this, as officers, we feel will be helpful for the panel to consider going forward. Now, some of them are coming sooner, rather, coming up quite quickly. So, for example, the strategy to tackle litter that Graham was referring to earlier. I personally think that would probably be something that would be helpful to bring back to the next meeting that we've got on the 21st of July, I think it is. As an example, also we've got to respond to the government legislation with regards to green waste, which is, as you can imagine, that's going to be quite, that will impact every resident that currently has the ability to recycle their green waste. And again, so this is a piece of government consultation and legislation, but I think it would be helpful to get the panel's input into that before that's submitted. Just checking with Graham, we're okay on time with that one? Just check with Graham. Are you there, Graham?
I am, sorry, I was on a different screen, complicated here. Yes, that's fine, George. Yes.
I think it's early August, isn't it? We've got to get it in by, I think, from memory.
The consistency one, no, it's earlier than that, I'm afraid. It's early July, so we won't be able to bring it back to the panel. The government consultation, we won't be able to bring it back to the panel. The plan was to share it with the chair, with Councillor Pentland, so that she had sight of it.
Okay. We perhaps pick this up offline, Councillor Pentland, but we could circulate it to the panel so they've got a line of sight into it. But we could pick that up.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. We're certainly we're on track. The work is underway, so we could share that this week to give the chairman, and if she wishes, the rest of the panel the opportunity to have a look at that.
Yeah. The other area that I think is imminent is obviously the work around developing the bus improvement plan linked to the bus strategy, and obviously that's going to involve quite an extensive piece of consultation over the summer months. So again, it may be helpful to bring something back to the July meeting on the bus strategy as well. And then I suppose it was over to yourselves, really. Clearly, climate change and how we take forward the climate change action plan that was developed by the Task and Finish group, chaired by Councillor Lorman in the Shadow Authority, and I know the chair, Councillor Pentland, has had conversations with Councillor Lorman, but how we start to bring that forward, and Rob was already alluding to some of the actions that we're already working on. And I know, again, going back to the address at the beginning of the meeting by Councillor Federich, that there are some quick wins that we are working through, and that we can probably highlight and look to promote proactively as part of that. So I think there's, I suppose I just wanted to sort of set the scene, really, but open it up to members based on what they've heard. And I appreciate some members may want to go away and reflect on what they've heard this morning. Others will have some clear views on what they've heard, and it will help myself and the team through the chair start to shape that forward plan. So I'm happy to pass back to you, Chair, for any views and comments from panel members.
Thank you. And if I could just speak quickly on that, I think what it'd be useful to do, as you highlighted, I've met with Councillor Lorman to go through the work the Climate Change Task and Finish group did, and there was clearly a lot of work there. If members of this panel haven't already had sight or looked at those recommendations and the report that was put together, I think that would be really useful to do, so that they're familiar with that work. and perhaps we can circulate that round promptly to people. So yeah, looking at those points and how we take that forward is really important. Picking up on the things Councillor Fedorovich raised at the beginning with regard to pesticides, etc. I think that would be interesting to look at, important to look at. I know that lots of councils up and down the country have banned or phased out glyphosate and other pesticides, including close by Cambridge. So it'd be useful to look at ones like that. There is lots of good background work going on. We've got a pilot scheme for the electric charging points on street, which is really good. And I know that officers have submitted a bid for funding for tree planting. So there's lots of good work going on, and it's how we enhance that. So happy to hand over to members for their comments as we set the scene for this a bit. Councillor Prentice just got his up, and then we'll go to Councillor Dale.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's just another point really on the electric charging points. And I was at the strategic planning meeting the other day as a member of the public, and I think it was actually Councillor Alabone that raised the need to ensure that future developments have a certain number of electric charging points going up with them. I think that's something that we could look to advise, that the need for new developments, there's plenty of them, to consider how many electric charging points are going up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's a really important point. And I know if we don't do things about this, there are going to be some real challenges in the future. I think about where I live and the inability I would have to charge a vehicle, an electric vehicle, and how we enable people to get electric vehicles and start using them properly. Thank you. Councillor Dow.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, officers, for your reports there. I was going to echo what Councillor Bone said, and said I've got a lot of questions that I don't think I can fit in now. I was at the same meeting that Councillor Prentice was at, and yeah, Councillor Alabone did raise the whole we need more EV charging points on new developments, but of course that's something that's got to come with the joint course strategy or the review of the strategy. So I've got questions about how long that's going to take. I've got questions about flooding, because my garden flooded last year, and I actually had some of the officers out looking at that this week. Yeah, I've got lots and lots of questions, which I'll send over on email. But thanks very much, guys.
Yeah, perfect, and that's really good if you can email over points, just to make sure we can carry on this discussion. So if we go to Councillor Alabone.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was just going to pick up on the comments you were making, alluding to the Councillor Fedorovich at the start of the meeting about pesticides, and you mentioned specifically glyphosate. Of course, glyphosate's been used for over 40 years now, right the way across the world. And there have been a lot of tests and trials independently of the chemical manufacturer itself to say that actually it is still pretty safe and it's widely used. In my own on my own farming methods, we don't plough or cultivate anymore. We direct drill for environmental reasons, but we do need glyphosate to get a clean seedbed beforehand. Now, if it were banned, I would have to go back to ploughing and cultivating. I would be pumping huge amounts of sulfur emissions from my tractors into the atmosphere. And I'll have to go back to using some of the older chemicals as well. And so I think we're obviously practicing carbon capture and carbon sequestration by direct drilling and not moving the soil. And of course, we're also improving soil porosity. So that helps with flooding. And of course, we're getting more flooding, as we all know, in certain parts of the country now. And so I'm mindful of the fact that a lot of the world are still using glyphosate. And I'm not sure that that's going to be a sort of take-all situation, a take-all win for anybody.
I appreciate your comments there, and it's really useful to have all the different levels of expertise that we've got on this, and looking at how we discuss this moving forward, I think will be important. Thank you. I'm not sure whose hand went up first, whether it was Councillor Dells or Councillor Bone. So if we go to Councillor Bone, and then I'll come to you, Councillor Dell.
Sexes and ladies first. Thank you, Chair. Just to reiterate my comments earlier, just thank the officers. Can I just, I assume that we're going to have the slides provided. Great, thanks, George. And the previous shadow climate group, you said that was going to get sent round. So if it's okay with everybody, I'll reserve my, bit like Councillor Dell, I will reserve my questions and send them by email. There are so many, I mean, which is great, because I think that's the whole idea, isn't it? It's produced lots of questions. So, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And Councillor Dell?
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to come back on Councillor Allardyce's point about glyphosate. I believe Councillor Fedorovich was talking about council use, so spraying on streets and parks and things, as opposed to obviously agricultural use. Thank you.
Sorry, having trouble with muting and unmuting. Perfect, thank you. So yeah, I think that, you know, it's a bit of a starting point for us. There's obviously so much work to do, and we need to really kind of develop out how we're going to do this and make it effective. If there aren't any other questions, I think today has been useful in finding our feet slightly. I'm really keen that we do make a difference, that this isn't a tag on. And I think that we have the potential, or we are going to, let's be positive here, we are going to make a real difference in a very overarching way, as Rob has said. We're not pigeonholed. We are able to work across the work of the council, and I look forward to doing that with all of your assistance. Please do email across those questions to whoever's appropriate, copying me in, etc., so we can really get to grips with this and make sure we're doing a good job. So I think we haven't got anything for item 9 of the agenda. So if everybody's happy, we'll close off the meeting there, and look forward to hearing from you all.